I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
Chapter 1. The millionaire's forgotten confession. The morning air in the brownstone was thick with the scent of potted orchids and the lingering, slightly ominous quiet that usually preceded a headache. I was sitting at my desk, busily typing up a report on a tedious job involving a wayward heir and a very stubborn private investigator, when the front door chime let out its usual insistent burr. Fritz moved to the hallway with that practiced, gliding grace of a man who knew exactly what was expected of him. I didn't bother to look up until the heavy oak door creaked open and the visitor stepped into the foyer. He wasn't the sort of client who usually graced our doorstep. He was tall, stiff, and carried himself with the kind of nervous precision that suggested he had spent his entire life waiting for someone else to tell him what to do. He was dressed in a suit that was expensive, but lacked the flair of a man who picked it out himself, and his eyes had a darting quality that made me think he'd spent a great deal of time checking for shadows behind his own back. Wolfe was in his chair, naturally, having already spent the better part of 3 hours tending to his beloved Miltoniopsis, orchids. He didn't look up from his ledger as the man approached, his massive frame perfectly still, his eyes focused on a particularly stubborn bloom. I stood up, leaning against the edge of my desk, and gave the visitor the once-over. He looked like he'd been scrubbed with wirewool and then pressed under a heavy weight. He didn't speak immediately, clearly intimidated by the sheer lack of interest emanating from the man behind the desk. It was a classic opening move in the Nero Wolfe theatre: let the client squirm until they were practically vibrating out of their shoes, and then, if the mood struck, offer them a seat. Finally, Wolfe sighed, a sound that could have deflated a small dirigible, and shifted his bulk slightly. He didn't look at the man, but his voice came out crisp and demanding, as if he were annoyed that the air in the room had been disturbed by something as mundane as a human problem. "You have arrived at a very inconvenient hour, sir. My morning schedule is entirely occupied by the demands of the greenhouse. My afternoon is reserved for digestion and deep meditation. If you have come to inquire about the weather, I suggest you consult the newspaper. If you have come to hire me, I suggest you state your business with a brevity that respects the sanctity of my time." The man stiffened further, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the handle of a small, leather-bound briefcase. He cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound that barely filled the space between us. "My name is Arthur Pendergast, Mr. Wolfe. I am the butler for the estate of Silas Vane. I have been in his service for 30 years, and I have never once had reason to doubt the security of his household. But as of yesterday evening, that security has been irrevocably shattered. A document of profound importance, a written confession regarding a decades-old deception, has vanished from his private study. I have been accused of the theft, and the local authorities are currently waiting for me to provide an alibi that I cannot possibly substantiate without implicating someone I have served for 3 decades. I do not care about my reputation, Mr. Wolfe, but I care a great deal about the truth." Wolfe finally looked up, his lips pursed in that expression of mild distaste he reserved for anything that required him to exert his intellect on behalf of a stranger. He didn't ask about the nature of the document, and he didn't ask why the police were involved. Instead, he simply tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long, uncomfortable moment. It was a performance, of course. He was already processing the information, filing away the details, and deciding whether or not the puzzle was worth the effort of lifting his head. I watched him, waiting for the inevitable show of arrogance that would either send Pendergast out the door or lead to a check being written. I knew the signs by now. When Wolfe looked at the ceiling like he was counting the rafters, he was already hooked. He just needed to make sure he looked like he was being dragged into it against his will. Chapter 2. Dust. On the mahogany, the transition from the initial hook to the realization that the brownstone was about to become the epicenter of a very peculiar storm was marked by the familiar cadence of a house in order. Fritz continued his preparations for lunch with a single-minded devotion that suggested the fate of the nation was less important than the proper reduction of a veal stock. Meanwhile, Archie Goodwin, that would be me, found himself in the uncomfortable position of playing buffer between a man whose world had just collapsed and a man who treated every client as a necessary evil to be tolerated until the check cleared. Pendergast remained seated on the edge of the yellow chair, his posture so rigid I half expected him to snap in half if he breathed too deeply. He had finished his initial statement, leaving the silence in the office to thicken like cold gravy. I watched Wolfe, whose eyes were closed, his fingers joined in the familiar arch over his center, contemplating the nature of 30 years of service, suddenly upended by a missing piece of paper. The study of Silas Vane sounded like the sort of place where things didn't just walk away, and yet here we were. I took the opportunity to lean back, balancing my chair on 2 legs, and began the delicate process of extracting the rest of the story. If Wolfe wanted to play the Sphinx, I would play the persistent reporter. "You say the document vanished yesterday evening, Pendergast," I said, keeping my voice casual, almost conversational. In a house like Vane's, I assume there are locks, keys, and probably a few staff members who know where the skeletons are buried. You've been there 30 years, which puts you in a prime position to notice if the floorboards creaked in the wrong place at the wrong time. If the police are leaning on you, it means you're the most convenient peg to hang the hat on. Start from the beginning. Not the 30-year part, but the last 48 hours. What changed? Was there a visitor, a phone call, a sudden shift in the master's mood? Pendergast looked at me, his gaze flickering toward Wolfe, who remained a statue of monumental indifference. He hesitated, then launched into a recital that sounded practiced, yet laced with a genuine creeping dread. It began on Monday, he explained, when Mr. Vane received an anonymous letter. He didn't share the contents, but I saw the expression on his face, a mixture of anger and a cold, calculating fear I had never seen before. He ordered me to bring him his heavy, iron-bound ledger from the wall safe in the study. He spent all afternoon reviewing accounts that haven't been touched in a decade. Then yesterday evening, he retired to the study of his nightly whiskey. He specifically instructed me to ensure that no one, not even his daughter, who is currently visiting from the city, was to approach the room for any reason. I adhered to that command, Archie. I stayed in the kitchen, meticulously polishing the silver service for the upcoming weekend. When I finally brought him his evening tea at 10, the study was unlocked, the safe was swinging on its hinges, and the ledger was gone. Mr. Vane was sitting in his chair, staring at the empty air, and when he saw me, he didn't call the police. He looked at me, his eyes hollow, and asked why I had betrayed him. Wolfe finally opened his eyes, the heavy lids lifting just enough to suggest he was no longer thinking about orchids. Betrayal is a heavy word, Mr. Pendergast, he murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the desk. It implies a degree of intimacy that often precedes a total collapse of character. You claim you were in the kitchen, yet you were the only individual with a key to the study besides Mr. Vane. The police are not irrational for focusing their attention on you. Tell me, is there anyone else who might have possessed a duplicate key? And more importantly, why does a man of 30 years' service come to me rather than seeking a lawyer, or perhaps fleeing the city? You are asking me to prove your innocence, which inevitably leads to the discovery of the true perpetrator. You understand the implications. If I find the thief, the betrayal you speak of will be exposed in all its ugliness. You are essentially asking me to burn your employer's house to prove you didn't steal the matches. The butler nodded slowly, his face drained of any remaining color. I have nothing to hide, Mr. Wolfe. The accusation is a stain on my life's work, and I will see it washed clean, regardless of the consequences for the Vane family. My life has been spent ensuring the order of that house. If that order is a lie, I would rather know the truth than continue to serve it. As for the key, there are no duplicates, Mr. Vane keeps his on his person at all times, and the only other key is locked in the pantry safe, which I alone have access to. I checked that safe this morning. The key is still there. It is a locked room mystery in the most literal, maddening sense. I am the only one who could have walked through that door. Yet I know, with the absolute certainty of a man who knows his own hands, that I did not take that ledger. I looked at Wolfe, waiting for the crack of a smile or the sudden spark of interest that signaled a case was beginning to take root in his mind. He didn't smile, but he did shift his position, his massive body settling deeper into the chair, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance. It was the look of a man who was already mapping the room, the suspects, and the hidden motives. The brown stone felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls were leaning in to hear the conclusion of the conversation. I knew what was coming next. The questions about the daughter, the contents of the missing ledger, and the inevitable moment where Wolfe would decide to charge a fee that would make Pendergast lose his breath. He liked cases that were neat, puzzles that could be solved with intellect, rather than chasing ghosts in the street. And this, by the sound of it, was as neat as a freshly pressed shoot. Chapter 3, a quartet of concerns. The atmosphere in the office had shifted from the clinical stillness of an inquiry to the heavy pressurized quiet that precedes a storm. Nero Wolfe was in his element, treating his office like a courtroom of wit. After a silence that lasted long enough for me to count the dust motes dancing in a shaft of afternoon sunlight, he finally turned his attention back to Pendergast. The butler had remained frozen, a monument to 30 years of loyal service and current bewilderment. Wolfe's voice, when he finally deigned to speak, was as smooth as expensive brandy and just as intoxicatingly dangerous. He began to dissect the household of Silas Vane with the precision of a surgeon who has no intention of stitching the patient back up afterward. He didn't start with the crime itself, which was typical. Instead, he forced Pendergast to catalogue every soul currently under the Vane roof. It was a quartet of potential trouble, or so it seemed once the butler finished his hesitant roll call. Aside from Silas Vane himself, a man whose wealth was matched only by the intensity of his suspicion, and the accused butler, there were 3 others. First, There was Eleanor Vane, the daughter, who had arrived from the city with a set of problems that sounded like she was hiding them behind a veil of social grace. Then came Julian Thorne, a business associate of Vane's who had been lurking around the estate for the better part of a week, supposedly to discuss a merger that had never actually materialized. Finally, there was the live-in secretary, a young man named Elias Croft, whose devotion to Vane was whispered to be even more intense than the butler's, though for entirely different, more ambitious reasons. Wolfe listened, his heavy eyelids lowered, and every time Pendergast paused, he would prompt him for more. He wanted to know about the temperaments, the small slights, the unspoken rivalries that festered in the grand rooms of the Vane estate. I took notes, my pen scratching across the pad, mapping out the relationships. It was a closed system, the kind of environment where friction inevitably led to fire. Pendergast spoke of the daughter with a mix of pity and exasperation, noting her frequent, hushed phone calls and her desperate need to avoid her father's scrutiny. Regarding Thorne, he was blunt. The man was a shark in a tailored suit, looking for a weakness in Vane's armor. And as for Croft, the secretary, Pendergast's voice turned cold. The young man was a sycophant, an opportunist who had spent the last year whispering into Vane's ear, slowly turning the old man against everyone, including the staff who had been there for decades. It was becoming clear that the theft of the ledger was merely the symptom of a deeper rot. Wolfe leaned back, his eyes closing entirely now, as if he were visualizing the house itself. "You have described a nest of vipers, Mr. Pendergast," he murmured, his tone devoid of judgment, but heavy with implication. "A man does not keep an iron-bound ledger in a locked safe for 30 years, unless he is holding the keys to the kingdom, or perhaps the skeleton keys to the graveyard. This document you refer to, this catalyst for the sudden change in your master's behavior, what was the nature of its contents? You do not need to have read it, but you have served this man for a generation. You know his worries better than he knows them himself. What does Silas Vane fear losing more than his money?" Pendergast shifted, his face tightening. "I believe it was evidence of a past indiscretion, Mr. Wolfe, not of a criminal nature, perhaps, but something that would destroy the standing he has spent his life building. Mr. Vane is a man of immense pride. He believes his story is as flawless as the accounts he manages. If that ledger contains proof that he is not the man he presents to the world, then the thief has not just stolen property, they have stolen his identity. The fear I saw in his eyes was not the fear of a man who had lost his fortune. It was a man's fear that had finally been unmasked. And he looks at me and sees the one person who has had the opportunity to witness his life from the shadows. He is not just looking for a thief, he is looking for a scapegoat to bury along with his secrets." Wolfe nodded, a gesture so slow it was almost imperceptible. A classic defense mechanism. If the truth is to be buried, it is best to place the blame on the individual most likely to have known where the shovel was kept. "Archie," he said, his voice caught my attention, "call Saul Panzer. Tell him to position himself near the Vane estate. He is not to make contact with anyone, least of all the master of the house. He is to observe the arrivals and departures. I want to know who leaves the house with a briefcase, a portfolio, or even a folded newspaper that looks heavier than it has any right to be." And he saw me again, his gaze sharp enough to cut glass. "You will visit this household under the guise of an investigator looking into a routine insurance matter. I want you to talk to this quartet. Keep your eyes on the secretary, and if the opportunity arises, see if the daughter is as anxious as our friend here suggests." I nodded, feeling the familiar rush of the game. It was a standard setup, but the stakes felt different this time. It wasn't about a missing diamond or a cheated spouse. It was about the crushing weight of a secret kept for 30 years, now floating in the ether, waiting to be claimed by the person with the most to gain. As Pendergast left, his posture marginally less rigid than when he arrived, I felt the weight of the task ahead. The brownstone would be quiet, as always, but for the next few days, it would be the command center for a war fought with whispers, observations, and the slow, methodical application of logic. Wolfe was already planning his dinner menu, but his mind was on the Vane estate, where the dust on the mahogany was about to be stirred by someone who knew exactly where to look for the truth. I grabbed my hat, checked my revolver, and stepped out into the city, ready to see what kind of secrets were waiting to be unearthed. Chapter 4: Footsteps in the Rain. The drive out to the Vane estate was a lesson in how quickly the city could give way to the kind of suffocating isolation that only the truly wealthy can afford. As I navigated my coupe through the winding, tree-lined lanes of the suburbs, a thick slate-grey sky began to weep a persistent, chilly rain. It wasn't the kind of storm that made headlines. It was a dreary, insistent drizzle that turned the world into a smudge of muted colors and blurred edges. It was, I decided, exactly the kind of weather that made people nervous, the sort of backdrop that turns a simple conversation into an interrogation. I parked the car a respectable distance from the Vane gate, took a moment to check my reflection in the rearview mirror, and adjusted my hat. If I was going to be an insurance investigator, I needed to look like a man who was burdened by paperwork and a lack of imagination. The estate was a sprawling, stone-clad monstrosity that looked less like a home and more like a fortress built by someone who expected an attack at any moment. As I walked up the long gravel path, my shoes crunching rhythmically against the wet stone, I felt the familiar itch of observation. Saul was out there somewhere, likely tucked into a thicket of rhododendrons, his eyes doing the work that 10 policemen would miss. I reached the front door and pressed the bell, listening to the chime echo through the cavernous interior. When the door opened, it wasn't Pendergast who greeted me. It was a man who looked like he had been put together, in a hurry, sharp angles, nervous energy and eyes that didn't seem to focus on anything for more than a second. He was thin, younger than I expected, and wearing a suit that was just a little too sharp for a man who spent his days as a secretary. This had to be Elias Croft. He looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and boredom, his hand resting on the edge of the door as if he were prepared to slam it in my face at the first sign of trouble. I gave him my most practiced, toothy grin, the one that suggested I was just a tired man trying to earn a paycheck. "I'm with the firm handling the Vane property assessment," I said, handing him a card I'd had printed up a few years back for occasions, just like this. "I'm here to finalize the audit on the recent security breach." Mr. Vane requested an inventory update. Croft's expression didn't change, but I saw his fingers tighten on the wood. "The security breach," he repeated, his voice thin and dry. "That's a delicate way to put it. Mr. Vane is currently in no mood to discuss inventory. He's under the weather, and the house is effectively on lockdown. You'll have to come back when the air is clearer." I started to argue, the classic, persistent, annoying insurance man routine, but he cut me off with a sharp wave of his hand. "I don't make the rules," he said, "but I enforce them. Mr. Vane is not to be disturbed. If you want to talk to someone, talk to the police. They're still hovering around the perimeter like vultures." I backed off, letting my shoulders slump a little, looking every bit the defeated drone. "Fine," I said, "but I'm going to need to make a note of this refusal in the file. If there's another incident, the firm isn't going to be happy about the lack of cooperation." I made a show of scribbling something in my notebook, all the while taking in the hallway. It was elegant, cold, and smelled of lemon polish and old, trapped air. I caught a glimpse of a woman standing at the top of the grand staircase, Eleanor Vane. She was watching us, her hand resting on the banister, her expression unreadable. She looked like a woman waiting for a bomb to go off, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flash of something in her eyes, not fear, but a desperate, calculating hunger. She turned and vanished into the shadows of the upper floor, before I could do more than offer a nod. Croft didn't see her. He was too busy trying to get rid of me. He shut the door with a finality that echoed in the empty drive. I walked back to my car, my mind working over the scene. The atmosphere in that house wasn't just tense. It was vibrating with a frequency that suggested everyone in it was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Croft was nervous. The daughter was volatile, and Vane himself was barricaded in his study, likely tearing his hair out over the missing ledger. I climbed into the driver's seat, pulled out my notebook, and scribbled down the observations. It was when I was backing out onto the road that I saw him. Saul was leaning against a utility pole 100 yards down, his collar turned up against the rain. I pulled over, and he slid into the passenger seat without a word, smelling of damp wool and wet earth. He didn't look at me, just stared straight ahead at the rain-slicked road. "You were right, Archie," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "There's a lot of movement for a house that's supposed to be under lockdown. About 20 minutes ago, a man in a grey sedan pulled up to the side entrance. He didn't ring the bell. Someone met him there, a woman. I couldn't be sure if it was the daughter or a guest, and they handed him a thick leather-bound folder. He didn't hang around. He drove like the devil was chasing him. I felt the prickle at the back of my neck. That wasn't the police. That was the missing piece, or at least a piece of it. I looked at the house one last time, the grey stone looming through the rain, and started the engine. We didn't have the ledger yet, but we had a thread, and in my experience, if you pull on a thread hard enough, the whole garment eventually comes apart. Wolfe was going to have a field day with this. I didn't know what was in that ledger, but I knew that someone was trying to sell it, and someone else was trying to kill it. The rain was picking up, and the night was closing in, but for the first time since Pendergast walked into the office, I felt like we had a clear target. We were moving, and that was always better than sitting still. Chapter 5. The missing infusion. When I got back to the brownstone, the atmosphere was thick enough to slice with a butter knife. I found Wolfe in his usual place. Though the tension was palpable, he was staring at a Vanda orchid that seemed to have offended him by failing to bloom on schedule. I didn't wait for him to acknowledge me. I pulled my chair up to his desk, tossed my notebook onto the polished wood, and gave him the full report, starting with the nervous energy of Elias Croft and ending with Saul's observation of the handoff in the rain. Wolfe didn't interrupt, but as I spoke, his fingers drummed a slow, uneven rhythm against the arm of his chair. By the time I mentioned the grey sedan and the leather-bound folder, his eyes were closed, his head tilted back in that posture of deep strategic contemplation that always preceded a move. Once I finished, the silence in the office stretched out until I could hear the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. Finally, Wolfe opened his eyes. He wasn't looking at me, but at the empty space where the ledger had once lived in his mind. "The theft of a document is never merely about the paper, Archie," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "It is the leverage it provides. If someone is handing off a folder in the rain, they are not acting out of a sudden, desperate urge to unburden themselves. They are negotiating. They are playing a game of chicken with someone who has something to lose. And based on your description of the Vane estate, there are at least 3 people who have everything to lose if that ledger is opened in public." He shifted his bulk, his expression turning cold. "We are looking at a hierarchy of desperation. Croft is the opportunist, the daughter is the wild card, and Thorne, I suspect, is the one holding the strings. But why the handoff now? Because the stakes have changed. Something in that ledger is time-sensitive. I need you to go back to the kitchen, Archie. Not to the estate, but to our own. I want you to go through the pantry. I suspect our friend Pendergast was not entirely forthcoming about the state of his own domain. You said he checked the safe, and the key was still there. I want you to confirm for yourself that nothing else was disturbed. A man who spends 30 years in one house knows every creak, every scent, and every misplaced item. If he didn't steal the ledger, someone who knew his routine did, and they left a signature." I did as I was told, heading down to the kitchen where Fritz was busy preparing a souffle that looked like it belonged in a gallery rather than an oven. I didn't mention the investigation, I just moved through the space, looking for anything that seemed out of place. It was a fool's errand, or so I thought, until I reached the spice rack near the back pantry. There, tucked behind a jar of dried marjoram, was a small empty canister that looked like it had been opened with a pair of pliers. It was for herbal infusions, the kind Pendergast used to soothe the old man's nerves in the evening. I pulled it out and flicked it in my hands. The seal was broken, but it wasn't just opened. The interior was coated in a fine white powder that didn't smell like any tea I'd ever encountered. I carried the canister back to the office and placed it on Wolfe's desk. He looked at it for a long time, then picked it up with a silk handkerchief, peering into the depths of the metal container. "A peculiar choice of vessel," he murmured, his voice tight. "It appears the ledger theft was only part of the operation. Someone was poisoning the atmosphere in more ways than one. This substance is an alkaloid, likely something that would induce a state of heightened anxiety and confusion. It would explain why Vane was so erratic, why he was so quick to distrust the man who had served him for 3 decades. He wasn't just being paranoid, he was being chemically assisted." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The ledger hadn't just been stolen, it had been recovered by someone who wanted to ensure that Silas Vane was in no state to stop them. The missing infusion wasn't just a detail, it was the mechanism of the crime. Wolfe looked at me, his eyes gleaming with the predatory focus I knew so well. "This changes the nature of our involvement, Archie. We are no longer merely investigating a theft of property. We are investigating a systematic attempt to dismantle a man's mental faculties. This requires a more direct intervention. Call Saul again. Tell him to track that grey sedan. I don't care if he has to sit on the driver's doorstep until the sun comes up. I want to know who is receiving these documents, and I want to know where they are keeping the rest of this substance." As I picked up the phone, I felt a surge of adrenaline. The case had transformed from a dry, intellectual puzzle into something with real sharp edges. We were closing in on someone, and it wasn't just an opportunist, it was someone with access, someone who understood the intricate, fragile machinery of the Vane household better than the owner himself. I dialed the number, my eyes locked on Wolfe, who was now leaning forward, his hands clasped, as if in prayer. The brownstone was no longer just a sanctuary, it was a theatre of war, and we were the ones holding the high ground. I finished the call, relayed the instructions, and looked back at my mentor. He didn't speak, but his look was clear. The game had entered its final, most dangerous phase, and there was no turning back now. Chapter 6, Shadows and Saul. The pressure in the brownstone had reached a point where the very air seemed to vibrate with a low, dissonant hum. Wolfe remained in his chair, a mountain of contained fury and cold calculation, while I paced the limited floor space like a caged animal. Saul Panzer had reported back, his voice crackling over the line with the kind of efficient, terrifying precision that only a man who specialized in the invisible could provide. The grey sedan had led him to a nondescript apartment complex in Queens, a place where anonymity was the primary currency and where the occupants rarely bothered to look each other in the eye. It was there that the handover had been completed, not to an accomplice, but to a professional courier, a man who worked for a high-end legal firm known for its ability to bury secrets beneath layers of bureaucracy. The implications were as clear as they were dangerous. The theft of the ledger and the systematic drugging of Silas Vane were part of a coordinated effort to force an outcome that would benefit someone waiting in the wings, someone with the resources to hire professional couriers and the influence to manipulate a man of Vane's standing. Wolfe listened to my summary of Saul's findings with his eyes closed, his breathing rhythmic and deep. He wasn't just processing the facts. He was building a structure, a mental map of the web that had been spun around the Vane estate. When I finished, he opened his eyes, and the look he gave me was one of grim satisfaction. "The strategy is evolving, Archie," he said, his voice a low, steady drone filling the room. "We are no longer dealing with a simple burglary. We are witnessing the execution of a hostile takeover, both of a legacy and of a man's autonomy. The infusion was the means, the ledger is the currency, and the courier is the final, irreversible step. If that document reaches the firm in Queens, it will be sealed, processed, and effectively erased from the record, providing cover for whatever machinations have been brewing in that household for months. We must disrupt the sequence. Saul has done his part. Now, we must play ours." He looked at me, his gaze intense. "I want you to go to that apartment complex. Do not enter the building. I have no interest in you ending up as a footnote in a local police report. I want you to intercept the courier when he leaves. He will be carrying the folder. He will be expecting to simply hand it off and be paid. You are to convince him, through whatever means you find most effective, that the contents of that folder are significantly more toxic than he was led to believe. Do not be violent, but do not be subtle. You are the shadow of Nero Wolfe, and you are here to claim what is rightfully ours." I felt a familiar, sharp thrill. The job was getting personal, and that was exactly how I liked it. I left the brownstone, the city streets feeling cold and unforgiving under the late afternoon sky. The apartment complex in Queens was a drab, grey structure that seemed to suck the color out of the surrounding neighborhood. I found a spot across the street, settled in behind the wheel of my coupe, and waited. It was a long, tedious business, the kind that tested your patience and your resolve. I watched the door, the comings and goings of the residents, and waited for the man Saul had described, a nondescript individual in a grey coat who carried a briefcase like it was made of fragile glass. 3 hours passed before he finally emerged. He moved with the practiced, hurried gait of a man who didn't want to be noticed, heading toward a parked car with a nervous, scanning glance. I didn't wait. I stepped out of the shadows, my hand resting casually but firmly on the piece in my pocket, and closed the distance between us before he could reach his door. I didn't need to say much. The look on my face and the way I carried myself was enough to stop him in his tracks. "I'm from the firm that was handling the Vane account," I said, my voice low and hard. "I'm here to take possession of that folder. Mr. Vane has had a change of heart, and the documentation is being redirected to a more secure location." The courier paled, his eyes darting to my hand in my pocket. He didn't argue. He knew when he was outmatched, and he certainly wasn't about to risk his career or his life for a job that had felt wrong from the very first handoff. He handed over the briefcase, his hands trembling slightly, and didn't wait for a second invitation. He backed away, scrambled into his car, and peeled out onto the street, leaving me standing there on the sidewalk, the prize securely tucked under my arm. It was done, but the real test was only just beginning. I headed back to the brownstone, the weight of the folder in my hands feeling heavier with every block. I didn't open it. That was a privilege reserved for the man who was currently waiting for me in the office. The game had entered its final, most dangerous phase. Chapter 7, The Geometry of Guilt. The office was filled with the heavy, lingering scent of old paper and the sharp, metallic tang of the ink that had been used to record decades of Silas Vane's secrets. Wolfe sat motionless, his eyes scanning the pages of the recovered ledger with a focus that was almost physically palpable. I stood by the door, nursing a drink I didn't particularly want, watching the man who could dismantle a human life simply by rearranging the facts. He turned a page, the sound of the parchment dry and brittle, and then closed the ledger with a soft final thud. He didn't speak immediately. He merely looked at me, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to measure whether I was prepared for the weight of what he had just uncovered. "The structure of the deception is elegant, Archie," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to anchor the room. "It is a geometry of guilt, where every angle is designed to deflect attention away from the center. Vane was not merely a victim of a theft. He was the victim of a long-term erosion, a campaign designed to isolate him from his only loyal confidant, our friend Pendergast, so that the conspirators could maneuver him into an irreversible financial decision. The ledger did not just hold secrets of his past, it held the proof that the Vane estate was already hemorrhaging money due to the very man he trusted most, Elias Croft. The secretary had been siphoning funds, and when he realized that Vane had finally begun to suspect the discrepancies, he orchestrated the theft of the ledger and the systematic poisoning to ensure the old man would be too incapacitated to notice his own ruin. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The pieces were falling into place with a terrifying logical clarity. Croft wasn't just an opportunist, he was a parasite who had been feeding on the estate for months, and he had been willing to destroy a man's mental health to cover his tracks. But what about the daughter? I asked, my voice tight. Where does she fit in? I saw her watching from the stairs, and she didn't look like a woman being manipulated. She looked like she was waiting for a payout. Wolfe nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture. She is the wild card, indeed. She was not a victim, but she was not the mastermind either. She was aware of Croft's activities, and she allowed them to continue because she believed that once Vane was declared incompetent, she would be the one to inherit the remainder of the fortune. She and Thorne were the ones facilitating the transfer of the ledger to the firm in Queens, intending to use the resulting scandal to force Vane into a permanent state of seclusion. They were all playing their parts, each one convinced that they were the architect of the final act, while they were actually being led by their own greed toward a trap they hadn't even begun to suspect. The realization that we were dealing with a collaborative web of treachery made the situation significantly more dangerous. We were not just exposing a thief, we were tearing apart a conspiracy that had already claimed the autonomy of an old man and was currently poised to dismantle his entire legacy. Wolfe leaned back, his eyes closing again. The strategy for the final movement is set. I want you to call Saul. He is to go to the estate and quietly ensure that the daughter and Thorne are not able to leave the premises. I want them present when I summon the entire group to this office tomorrow. He paused, a faint, predatory smile touching his lips. As for Croft, we will handle him ourselves. He has been the one managing the infusion, and I suspect he is also the one who has been maintaining the false accounts in the ledger. When he arrives, he will be under the impression that the document is already in the hands of a Queen's firm. He will come here expecting to finalize the destruction of Silas Vane. Instead, he will find the proof has been returned to its rightful owner. I want the office prepared for the gathering. I want no distractions, no interruptions, and I want the atmosphere to be as stifling and as controlled as a vacuum. I went to the phone, my mind buzzing with the logistics of the invitation. It was a bold move, summoning a group of people who were essentially fighting over the remains of a man's life, but it was exactly the kind of theater that Wolfe excelled at. I made the calls, my voice steady, relaying the instructions to Saul with the quiet efficiency that he always appreciated. As I hung up the receiver, I looked back at the office. The brownstone felt different now, more like a staging ground than a house. The geometry of the case had shifted. We were no longer just observers. We were the ones who were going to dictate the terms of the conclusion. Outside, the city was dark, the rain having ceased but leaving the streets slick and reflective under the streetlights. Tomorrow, the office will be crowded with suspects. For the first time, I felt the genuine, keen anticipation of a man who knows that he is about to witness the absolute, logical unraveling of a human tragedy. Wolfe was already planning the menu for our dinner, his priorities as unshakable as his conviction that justice, when applied with the right amount of pressure, always finds its way to the surface. I sat at my desk and began to organize the notes, the quiet rhythm of my pen the only sound in the office, as we waited for the final, inevitable climax of a story that was about to be laid bare. Chapter 8. The unbroken silence. The office was prepared for the gathering with a meticulousness that would have shamed a museum curator. I had arranged the chairs to ensure that each suspect would be perfectly framed by the afternoon light filtering through the blinds, while Wolfe, in his massive custom-built chair, sat behind the desk like an idol of intellectual judgment. When the doorbell finally burned, Fritz admitted them in a silence that was more damning than any accusation. Eleanor Vane entered first, her face a mask of nervous pride, followed by Julian Thorne, who wore his confidence like a cheap suit, and finally Elias Croft, who looked as though he were walking to the gallows. Silas Vane followed, his gait uneven, his eyes clouded by the fog of the substance that had been systematically fed to him. Wolfe waited until they were seated before he even acknowledged their presence. He didn't offer tea, and he didn't offer comfort. He simply stared at the middle distance, his fingers locked over his stomach. The silence in the office was absolute, a heavy, airless vacuum that seemed to press against their chests. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it possessed a gravity that forced every head in the room to snap toward him. "We are here to conclude a matter of business," he began, his tone devoid of emotion. "Pendergast came to me because he was accused of a betrayal he did not commit. He came to me because his life's work was being dismantled by those who believed that power is best served in the dark, and behind the backs of those who have built it." He reached into the folder on his desk and pulled out a single sheet of paper, letting it rest there without looking at it. He was focused on Croft. The secretary didn't move, but the color drained from his face until he looked like a statue carved from chalk. "You thought you were clever, Mr. Croft," Wolfe continued. "You believed that by siphoning off the funds and systematically drugging your employer, you could force him into an incompetency, hearing that would allow you to control the remains of his estate. You and your partners, the daughter and Mr. Thorne, operated on the assumption that a man who has lived as long as Mr. Vane could be easily discarded. You were wrong. A life, even one built on secrets, has a gravity of its own. Eleanor let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, her hand flying to her throat as if to stifle a scream. Thorne stood up, his face hardening, his hands clenched into fists, ready to object, but a single, sharp look from Wolfe sent him back into his chair as if he had been struck. "I am not interested in your protestations, Mr. Thorne," Wolfe murmured. "The ledger is in my possession. Every transaction, every unauthorized withdrawal, and every signature you forged is currently being catalogued. The police are not outside because I have not invited them yet. That decision rests entirely with the individual who decides to confess first. If you want to avoid the cold embrace of the legal system, you will tell the truth." Now, the tension in the office was palpable, the kind of friction that happens right before a dam breaks. Thorne looked at the daughter, his eyes narrow and calculating, but she was already looking at the floor, her composure completely shattered. Croft was the first to break, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine as he started to babble about the pressure, the opportunities he'd been denied, and the ease with which he had manipulated the situation. It was a sordid, ugly performance. As I watched him, I felt a wave of disgust. He wasn't a mastermind, he was just a small man who had spent too long feeding on someone else's success. He revealed the method of the infusion, the location of the falsified accounts, and the names of the outside brokers they had been using to launder the stolen money. Once the confession was finished, the room felt empty, even with all of us in it. Wolfe sat back, his eyes closing, the victory achieved with the same effortless precision he applied to his orchids. I stepped forward, ushering a lot of them out the door. Saul was waiting in the hall to ensure they made their way to the authorities without any more detours. Silas Vane remained, staring at Pendergast with a look of profound, dazed relief. The butler said nothing, he simply stood there, his loyalty finally vindicated, the order of his world restored at the cost of the man he had served for 30 years. After they were gone, the brownstone returned to its natural state. The silence wasn't ominous anymore, it was simply quiet. Fritz had begun the process of preparing dinner, the familiar comforting sounds of the kitchen drifting through the hallway. Wolfe, having finished his work, was once again looking at his ledger, his mind already drifting toward the evening meal, and the bottle of fine red he had been saving for a special occasion. I stood by the desk, listening to the city rumble outside, feeling the weight of the last few days finally lifting. The office felt clean again, stripped of the greed and petty ambitions that had dared to intrude upon the sanctity of 35th Street. We had our home back, and more importantly, we had the satisfaction of knowing that the arithmetic of justice had been solved to the final decimal point. Chapter 9, The Orchid's shadow. The aftermath of such a dramatic exit left the office feeling remarkably light, as if a layer of grime had been scrubbed from the floorboards. Silas Vane, now shaking off the lingering mist of his chemical prison, had been escorted out by a pair of men Saul had hired for the occasion. Men who looked like they wouldn't hesitate to handle a riot if the need arose. Pendergast had followed them to the door, his posture finally slackening, the heavy metallic rigidity of his duty replaced by a quiet, exhausted grace. He had paused for a moment at the threshold, giving a single, solemn nod to Wolfe, a gesture of profound gratitude that required no words, before departing to help his master navigate the wreckage of his life. Wolfe was back in his chair, but the fire had gone out of his eyes, replaced by the serene, almost infantile placidity that always followed a triumph of the intellect. He was currently retending to a cattleya that had been neglected during the office's occupation, his massive fingers moving with a delicacy that defied his bulk. I, meanwhile, was busy with paperwork. There was the matter of the files I'd collected, the notes on the depositions, and the inevitable, long-winded report for the insurance firm that I'd have to invent to keep our cover story consistent. It was a tedious business, but it kept my hands busy and my mind from dwelling too heavily on the ugliness of the afternoon. The sanctity of the brownstone was returning to its natural state. Fritz came in with a silver tray, placing a small glass of beer and a bowl of fresh crackers on the desk, his movements as unobtrusive as a shadow. He didn't ask about the case, and he didn't ask why the office had been filled with the stench of 3 panicked, greedy people only an hour before. He just knew that balance had been restored, and that was enough for him. I poured myself a drink, the glass cool and condensation slicked in my hand, and looked over at my boss. Wolfe was humming a low, tuneless melody, his concentration entirely focused on the plant's roots. It struck me then, as it often did, how little the world outside really understood about the man in the chair. To the police, he was a nuisance. To his clients, he was a miracle worker. To the people we had just cast out, he was a demon of logic. But here, in the quiet of the late afternoon, he was just a man who liked his orchids, his beer, and his solitude. The case had been a disruption, a temporary, irritating intrusion, and now that it was resolved, he had discarded it as easily as one might discard a finished crossword puzzle. There was no residue of triumph in his face, no lingering trace of the battle he had just orchestrated from his seat. I thought about the ledger, now sitting in the safe in the basement, waiting to be turned over to the authorities as evidence. It held the ruins of a family, the wreckage of 30 years of careful deception, and the proof of a betrayal that had almost cost a man his soul. And yet, none of that seemed to touch the office air. The brownstone held no memory of the crimes that were brought to its door. It only held the weight of the order we insisted on maintaining within its walls. I finished my drink and leaned back, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor, feeling the tension drain out of my own shoulders. The city outside was beginning its evening surge, a distant, muffled roar of engines and sirens that felt like it belonged to a different planet. I had my desk, my typewriter, and the certainty that tomorrow would be another day of whatever came next. Wolfe stopped his humming and looked up at me, his eyes bright and alert again, though the predatory edge was gone. "Is the accounting finished, Archie?" he asked, his voice crisp and clear. "I don't care for lingering debris. When the case is closed, the record must be complete. I want no loose ends, no trailing threads of inquiry that might tempt a persistent journalist or a disgruntled lawyer. We have rendered a service. Let us ensure that we are not required to provide a post-mortem." I nodded, already reaching for the folders I'd laid out on the edge of the desk. "Everything is blocked," I said. "Saul is handling the transition to the police, and the evidence is secured. We're clean, Wolfe. We're as clean as if we never knew the vain name." He nodded, satisfied, and returned his attention to the orchid. The silence stretched between us, comfortable and absolute, the kind of silence that only exists between two people who have spent years navigating the dangerous, rewarding currents of the human condition. I turned to my typewriter, the keys already waiting, and began the final formal summary of the investigation, the rhythmic clack-clack, providing a fitting, mechanical heartbeat to the end of another chapter. Chapter 10, the final digestive. The dinner that followed was, as always, an affair that bordered on the religious. Fritz had outdone himself, presenting a braised capon that practically fell away from the bone at the mere suggestion of a fork, accompanied by a reduction that tasted of history and patience. Wolfe sat at the head of the table, his napkin tucked into his collar, his face a mask of concentrated bliss as he savored each morsel. I sat opposite him, my own plate emptied with a speed that usually drew a silent, disapproving glance from my mentor. But tonight, even he seemed to be in an indulgent mood. The air in the dining room was warm, smelling of savory herbs, and the faint sweet perfume of the flowers that decorated the center of the table. We ate in the kind of silence that only men who have spent the day dismantling a conspiracy can truly appreciate. There was no need for chatter. The events of the afternoon had been processed, filed, and effectively relegated to the past. The brownstone was at peace. The Vane estate was a distant, dying echo of an unpleasantness that no longer held any claim on our attention. Wolfe took a long, slow sip of the burgundy, his eyes half closed as he let the vintage settle on his palate. He set the glass down with a delicate clink and sighed, a sound of profound, world-weary contentment that seemed to fill the room. "The appetite, Archie," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant rumble, "is perhaps the only honest indicator of a man's character. It is never satisfied by the accumulation of power, nor is it tempered by the acquisition of prestige. It is a biological imperative, a demand for sustenance that cannot be cheated, bargained with, or manipulated. Look at the people who passed through our office today. Their hunger was not for the capon on this table. It was for the ephemeral, the hollow, and the ultimately destructive. They sought to devour a man's legacy because they had forgotten how to nourish their own souls." I finished the last of my wine and leaned back, watching the flicker of the candlelight dance across his face. "It's a good way to look at it," I said, playing with the spirit of the moment. "But I think a lot of people just like the taste of what isn't theirs. It's an easy habit to pick up, especially when you're surrounded by people who think that having more is the same thing as being more. Croft and the daughter, they weren't just hungry. They were starving, even if they didn't know what they were trying to fill." Wolfe nodded slowly, his fingers tapping the linen tablecloth. "Precisely. They suffered from a spiritual malnutrition that rendered them incapable of perceiving the consequences of their own actions. They operated on the fallacy that because they could manipulate the machinery of a life, they were somehow entitled to the results. It is a common delusion among the mediocre. They see a system, they see a weakness in the system, and they immediately assume that the system was built for them to exploit. They fail to realize that the system, be it a family, a business, or a human relationship, is held together by invisible threads of mutual obligation. Once you snap those threads for personal gain, the entire structure eventually collapses upon you." He gestured vaguely toward the kitchen, where Fritz was likely already preparing the coffee. "I find that as I grow older, the spectacle of human folly becomes increasingly repetitive. The motives are always the same: fear, greed, or a desperate, clawing need to be significant. The methods, too, rarely vary. The poison in the tea, the stolen ledger, the anonymous letter, They are all just variations on the same tired, discordant theme. We are occasionally called upon to be the audience, or even, when the situation demands it, the critics. But it is an exhausting role. One should never be required to spend so much time in the company of the pathetic. I grinned, feeling the familiar warmth of the wine and the quiet, rock-solid stability of the brownstone surrounding us. I'll keep that in mind the next time the doorbell rings, I said. Maybe I'll start telling people that you're busy contemplating the nature of human folly and can't be disturbed unless they have a really interesting case. Perhaps a jewel heist or a kidnapping that involves someone with a bit more imagination than our friend Croft. Wolfe chuckled, a rare, dusty sound that barely moved his shoulders. You would do no such thing. And well, we both know it. You enjoy the circus too much to deny yourself a ringside seat. You are, at heart, a collector of human specimens, Archie. You find the variety of their stupidity as compelling as I find the variety of the orchids. The difference is that I am content to watch the bloom while you feel the need to document the decay. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and adjusted his vest with a satisfied pat. The dinner was adequate, Fritz. He called out toward the kitchen, his voice resonant and commanding. Tomorrow, we shall return to the regimen of the greenhouse. I have a Vanda that requires a strict balance of humidity and patience, and I have no intention of allowing it to suffer the indignity of further neglect. I shall be in the office, but only for the purpose of correspondence. If the phone rings, see that it is someone with a legitimate inquiry into the botanical sciences, or at the very least, someone with the good sense to know when they are out of their depth. I watched him walk toward the study, the massive, imposing figure that had spent the day holding the fate of a fortune in his hands, now entirely focused on the needs of a plant. I stood up, cleared the table, and made my way to the living room, feeling the quiet, settled satisfaction of a man who knows that no matter what tomorrow brings, tonight is secure. The city was still out there, loud and chaotic, but in the brownstone the rhythm remained unbroken. I let out a long breath, picked up a book, and prepared to close out the night. After all, the orchids wouldn't wait forever, and neither would the next client. But so far, silence was perfect.